Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Year 10. This is a useful revision podcast, not only for the upcoming summer exam, but also for the topics more generally. Now, I've done detailed podcasts on rivers, coasts, economic energy, and the fieldwork already, so check those out. But this is more of a general, around the summer exam podcast for you to use. Now, it's worth noting that these topics won't come up together in the real exam. Okay, so what I've done is I'll let you know, I've tailored this exam to what I have taught you, and therefore I can assess you at the end of year 10 on what you have learnt with me. But coasts and the economy and energy are not in the same exam because they're different topics. So this is not how it will look in the real thing, but I'll also give you sections like it was the real exam. So I've combined different papers and put it into one, basically. For rivers, it's important that you know the different features. So what is a mouth? What is the source? So the mouth is the end of the river where it goes to the sea. The source is the start. You need to know about where these features are. So, for example, delta and estuary in the lower course, oxbow lake, meanders and waterfalls in the middle course, and then V-shaped valleys and interlocking spurs in the upper course. Make sure you know about the water cycle more generally and how a river fits into its own drainage basin, with this watershed being the boundary around that. And then give different keywords like tributaries, a small side river, confluence, where a small side river meets a main river. And then just the water cycle, so different stores of water can be in the clouds, can be the ocean, can be rivers, can be underground, and transfers is the way they move, so evaporation, precipitation, etc. Then you look in rivers more generally, and you look at 4 different types of transportation. So traction, saltation, suspension, solution, and the 4 different types of erosion being hydraulic action, attrition, abrasion, and again solution. And knowing basically how each of those work, like what each of those key terms means. In the exam, throughout every section, you'll have a figure to use, so it's important that you use that in the right way. Knowing, for example, about how we can use urban areas in terms of flooding. So what is the threat of having urbanization and causing flooding? How can maybe you reduce the impacts of flooding? Looking at flooding prevention strategies like embankments or flood walls, or even afforestation. I would revise hydrographs, so knowing about a storm hydrograph and lag times and peak discharge and what that means. So discharge is the amount of water that passes through a river at any given point, and how that varies. So the more rain, the more water going in the river, the higher the discharge. The quicker this happens, the quicker that will rise up. Steeper lag time normally means a more flashier flood. Know about landforms like levees, waterfalls, how those things form, basically. You should be able to explain what they are, and in maybe like 3 or 4 steps how they form. So whether you use the words vertical erosion, whether you use the words lateral erosion, whether you use the words hydraulic action, abrasion, using specific key terms rather than rock is eroded, it is better for an answer. You will get more marks for that. And then again, using figures for big 8-mark questions. So, know what dams can be used for, know how you can use dams to manage the demand of water, the supply of water, and how this can be done in demand and supply of water from rivers in real life places. So, that includes learning about case studies as well as using your figures in the exam questions. So then you come on to coasts. So I would definitely recommend learning about key terms again. So what are the 4 types of erosion? They're the same as rivers. Making sure you know what longshore drift is and how, again, to explain that process in maybe 4 sentences or so. Looking at what a mangrove system is, a mangrove ecosystem, and not only knowing what they are, but the benefits and the cons of them. So what is a good thing, what is a bad thing, what are they like, the characteristics. Much like rivers, how you can reduce the impacts of flooding. So slightly differently for coast as it is in rivers, don't forget. So coastal flooding, sea walls, groins, gabions, rock armour, those kind of things, how they work, what they do. and maybe the difference between soft engineering and hard engineering strategies. And then that links in very nicely to, well, actually, what are the pros and cons with them? You need to be able to evaluate the pros and the cons with soft and hard engineering, and ultimately why certain groups of people would choose certain engineering strategies. For example, there might be conflicts, right? So if you are a government with limited funds, a seawall is great for protecting flooding, but it's very, very expensive. If you're in a business like a hotel or a bar or a restaurant right on the seafront, you're going to insist on a seawall. These problems will only be exacerbated, that means made worse, by climate change. So climate change, the inevitable impact of that is rising sea levels, right? Because glaciers are going to melt, and therefore sea levels will rise up, causing areas that are currently at the coast to flood, because the ocean will be at a higher level. Key terms again, so different types of waves, so destructive wave, constructive wave, what that means in terms of backwash and swash. So destructive waves have greater backwash, they take sediment away, whereas constructive waves have greater swash because they build up beaches there. And then features of deposition, so spits, bars, tombolos. Again, you should be able to describe in 2 to 3 sentences how each of those form, and the same can be said for arch, cave, crack, stack, stump, the features of erosion at the coast. So again, what happens with that? How does it form? Maybe mentioning specific types of erosion like hydraulic action makes a better answer here, and then maybe view it as like a big story. You start with a big crack, turns into a cave, turns to an arch, turns to a stack, turns to a stump, because erosion is continuous. And then again, you'll have figures to use for this topic and case studies. I'm not going to go over them in this podcast, but just make sure that you revise your case studies for coastal ecosystems just like you would with rivers. So how you manage threats to ecosystems by the coast, how you manage any problems that you get there, maybe it be through erosion, maybe through damage, maybe it's tourism, and how that can actually help an area if it's managed properly. And then you have economic activity and energy. Just remember again, this topic won't normally be in the same exam as rivers and coasts because it is a human geography topic, not a physical one, but it will be something you are tested on. So in terms of key terms, looking at different types of energy, so renewable, non-renewable, geothermal, solar, fossil fuels, those kind of key terms you are expected to know. Not only that, but looking at geothermal energy, looking at solar energy, looking at wind energy, looking at fossil fuels, you should know pros and cons. What is a positive? What is a negative? What is an advantage? What is a disadvantage? For renewable energy, for non-renewables, knowing the definitions, knowing the difference. You also should basically know about ways you can make different energy sectors more sustainable. So what could you do to, for example, to make transport more sustainable? That might be more electric cars. What could you do to make the lighting sector more sustainable? Maybe energy saving light bulbs. I'd also recommend for energy and economy, looking at the economy too. So looking at what formal employment is, looking at what the difference between that and informal employment is, where that's taking place. So have a good example of where formal and informal economy are located. And then obviously then you have the primary, secondary, tertiary and quaternary job sectors. So primary is like farming, higher in poorer countries. Secondary is manufacturing, higher in developing countries. And then tertiary is services, so things like doctors, teachers, nurses, waitresses, things like that. Providing a service, that's higher in HIC, richer countries. And then quaternary is research and design, and that's normally the smallest sector, not too common anywhere. So understand about why informal employment exists in poorer countries. Again, some good and bad things about it, and the same with formal employment. If you can name some advantages and disadvantages of that, then you're all set. Maybe consider key terms like demand for energy, so energy security, energy insecurity. If you are short of energy, if you haven't got a constant supply, you are insecure in your supply. That's not a very good thing. Consider the 3 theories I taught you. So Bossrup and Malthus being 2 of those, and about how more people, more energy supply, more people, more food supply. And then also consider different factors that might affect where you find primary, secondary, tertiary and quaternary sectors. So obviously for primary, you're going to have land that's available for farming and a suitable climate, for example. For tertiary, you have to have enough money in that sector. For quaternary, you're going to have enough technology, enough space, and enough capable people and skills to be able to make that work. And ultimately understand the overarching theme between these four sectors is how a country, we did the UK in lessons, but other countries do the same thing, and about how they change. So 200 years ago, the UK was largely a farming and a manufacturing country. Over time, as money improved and the areas developed and healthcare improved, people lived longer and migration, all those things, ultimately more people started to work in the secondary sector, less in the primary. Then the tertiary sector started, more service jobs. And then, in the 1950s, deindustrialization meant factories closed, and therefore factories went to cheaper places like China, Indonesia, Vietnam, where they are today. Therefore, in the UK, for example, the secondary sector started to go down too, and then the tertiary sector took over and became maybe the 80% overall rate of job availability. And then you had the introduction of quaternary sector jobs with an increase in technology, AI, research and things like that, with universities being an example. And then one topic that will come alongside this topic in the real exam, so one thing we've studied that will come alongside energy and economy, is the other human topic we studied, which is urban environments. So this will take, I think, more revision because it's been quite a while since we've done it. So this is looking back at urban environments, knowing what urban means, cities and towns, knowing what rural means. And then once you know those, you can work out what rural-urban migration is, people moving from rural to urban areas, and then urban-rural, and different reasons and benefits and costs of both of these. Then consider about how these areas come to be, so looking at greenfield sites and brownfield sites, knowing the differences, and again, knowing the pros and cons with building on them. So building on a greenfield is often cheaper, but damaging the environment. Building on a brownfield site is often easier, but also actually needs to be cleared first, so isn't necessarily the easiest thing. And then you obviously, with developing, you have urbanization, and that's a really important key term to learn. Urbanization, an area becoming more like a town or a city, and some of the benefits and costs with this as a process. So benefits could be jobs, more money in an area, more tax, but obviously a disadvantage could be traffic congestion, could be overrun services like schools and hospitals. Then start to look at the city in terms of different layouts, so inner city, outer city, suburbs, and then you've got the rural urban fringe beyond that, and basically understand the characteristics of each different part of the city using the Burgess model. Again, this might require more revision. So in the inner city, CBD, Central Business District, often you get skyscrapers, often you get banks and businesses. In the inner city, you might get small houses, small flats, tower blocks. If you go further out into the suburbs and the rural urban fringe, you are more likely going to get things like business parks and bigger houses with 2 bedrooms, gardens and pools, things like that require people to commute to the inner city. You also may get factories happening in both the inner city and the outer city, but the outer city has more space, so perhaps that's easier since the invention of transport, where people can get to you, not only just resources, but also themselves in terms of workforce. We looked at megacities and world cities, so knowing those definitions, please, and obviously how they have improved and how the number of them have increased in particularly developing countries. And then, counter urbanization, I would know the definition of that and what has caused that. Suburbanization, what is the definition of that? What has caused that? You need to be able to explain those things. So if you're not sure about those, go and pause the video and go and find the answer. But ultimately explaining what has caused people to move to the suburbs. For example, you could mention bigger houses, improvements in transport, more space, cleaner air, that kind of thing is what you need to know. And then conversely, in poorer countries, what are slums? What are squatter settlements? Look at your case studies for this. Think about how these areas have become overpopulated, they become dirty, they haven't got the right resources, and there's not enough stable access to electric or water or gas or heat. and knowing the challenges that take place in slums and squatter settlements, knowing a scheme that has been brought in to improve these areas. So what has been done in specific countries, use your case studies to improve living conditions for these people. What has been done in terms of improving these areas, improving transport, improving the quality of housing, improving access to sanitation, whether it be improved healthcare, water, food, whatever it may be. And again, knowing your 2 case studies. So for this topic, you need to know, for urban environments, an LIC case study and a HIC case study. And again, one of my most important top tips of all time is if you are asked about a developing country, you need to write about a developing country. Look what happened recently in the most recent exam. People wrote about the wrong country, lost out on all the marks entirely. If the question asks you about, for example, challenges facing developed countries, you can't then go and use Nigeria. You have to use the UK. So what challenges are being faced? And also, what's being done about them? And then you combine that with often you're being asked to use a figure. So you do use a figure plus your own understanding. In an 8-marker that asks about a figure, this is my advice always. You need to write an 8-marker using a figure and your own understanding. I'd recommend your first paragraph use the figure, and then 2 and 3 use your own understanding. That means you've done everything the examiner has asked you to do. And the final bit of your exam, again, this won't be necessarily next to coasts or rivers, is your fieldwork question. So by the time this exam comes around, not by the time this podcast goes out, you would have done your urban fieldwork. And again, like I said in lessons, you need to know not only about your own investigation, but the skills about your own investigation that could apply to others. For example, you could be asked a question about why did you do this, what justify why you use this sampling methods. But also what you might get is, Timmy and Tommy in this exam fictional research fieldwork, they did this. What is good about that? What could they have done better? So it's knowing about the fieldwork skills objectively as an overall, but not only you can apply to your own fieldwork, but you can apply to other examples of it. So, knowing key terms like qualitative data, being more written, being more wordy, being more opinion-based, quantitative data being more numerical and number-based. Again, looking at the advantages and disadvantages of different presentation types. We haven't done this in lesson at the time of recording, but graphs, tally charts, things like that. And then stratified, systematic, and random sampling methods. Knowing what they are, the difference between them, and the pros and the cons. So random, for example, is fair, but also may get inaccurate data. Stratified, having a strategy makes sense, is often safe, but again could be used to fixate results and could lead to bias. Systematic may look good and be even, but ultimately also with having a system is it might not be plausible. For example, every 100 metres to measure some data, you might be standing in the middle of the road, which is obviously not sensible. And you do get 8 markers in fieldwork questions too. So for example, you might get some figures, you might get some data that somebody has collected. Again, not what you've done, but what has happened in a fictional setting. You say, for example, you might get an extract from a random student's data collection, like a fictional made-up one, and you have to evaluate that. You have to be able to say, okay, what has this person done well? What has this person done badly? How could they do this better? What were some limitations? What was done good? And that could be about fairness, it could be about systems choosing, it could be about sampling methods, it could be about data presentation, it could be about their analysis. And you need to be able to not only evaluate what they could do better and what they've done well, but also, of course, about what you did good, but what you could have done better too. And it's about, whenever there's a figure question, using the figures in the right way to the best of their ability without just directly lifting from them. So one big problem that people have in year 10 and 11, particularly in year 10, is if they are asked to use a figure, they only use the figure in the exam question. You are capped at a low grade for that. If you have an 8 marker and you're asked to use the figure and you only use the figure, you lift from it. What lifting means is you copy it. You write down what the figure says. Examiners see straight through that. Okay, my number one top tip is always to read the question carefully and make sure you've answered the question, but you can't just live data from the graph given to you, because anybody could do that. It's the skill in evaluating what that means and being able to explain that. So that is, in a nutshell, the 4 topics plus the fieldwork element that you will be examined on in this year's exams. It then leaves only a couple of topics to do next year, so this is a good way to revise overall different topics and have a good practice at it. Any questions, let me know in the comments. Come and see me. Otherwise, take care and I'll see you soon.